sirens echo through the streets of Dar es Salaam. The air smells of smoke and sweat. Young voices rise against the night, chanting words once whispered only in private: freedom for Tanzania. For decades, Tanzania was known as East Africa's calm heart, no coups, no chaos, a quiet nation led by steady hands. But that image has just shattered. What began as a single political decision, the government blocking opposition figure John Heche from crossing into Kenya to attend Raila Odinga's funeral, has ignited a storm no one can control. The streets are alive with anger. Students, riders, and workers march together, their chants echoing through cities once known for silence. President Samia Suluhu Hassan, celebrated worldwide as East Africa's first female head of state, now faces the most serious challenge of her career. Once seen as a symbol of national unity, she stands accused of turning the nation into a cage where dissent is a crime and democracy is an illusion. The arrest of opposition leader Tundu Lissu, followed by the travel ban on his ally Heche, has become the spark that awakened an entire generation. Across universities, cafes, and rural communities, a question now burns in every conversation. Has Tanzania reached the point where freedom of speech is treated as rebellion? The tension is no longer confined within its borders. Youth from both Kenya and Tanzania are linking arms in defiance, a cross-border movement born out of shared frustration and digital solidarity. This is no ordinary protest. It is a generational reckoning, a test of whether East Africa's young democracies can still breathe under growing political pressure. So tonight, as Tanzania trembles, one question echoes beyond its borders. Are we witnessing the birth of a new democratic awakening or the rise of another African dictatorship? If you believe that truth must outlive fear, please share this story. And if you stand for freedom in Africa, subscribe to stay informed. Under the humid April air of 2025, Dar es Salaam felt unusually restless. Police trucks lined major streets, and whispers carried faster than the wind. Something was changing in Tanzania, something that could no longer be ignored. Just a few years earlier, President Samia Suluhu Hassan was celebrated as a symbol of calm after the sudden death of John Pombe Magufuli. She promised healing dialogue and a return to balance. Western diplomats praised her as a fresh chapter for Tanzania. But by 2025, that promise had begun to fade. Her government's refusal to reform the Electoral Commission, repeated arrests of opposition figures, and growing control over the press painted a different reality, one of quiet consolidation of power. The breaking point came when John Heche, a close ally of the imprisoned opposition leader Tundu Lissu, attempted to leave the country. His purpose seemed harmless: to attend the funeral of Raila Odinga, Kenya's longtime opposition icon, a man who had inspired democratic movements across the continent. Yet, the Tanzanian authorities claimed his travel posed a national security threat. Soldiers were sent to the airport. Heche was stopped, detained, and later confined to his home. The news spread like wildfire. Within hours, hashtags "Jark Let Heche Go" and "Span Free Lissu" trended across Tanzanian social media. Young people flooded X, formerly Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube, with fiery posts accusing the government of dictatorship. For the first time in years, Tanzanians were not afraid to speak publicly about power and to challenge it. At the University of Dar es Salaam, hundreds of students gathered on the campus lawn waving handmade posters that read, "Freedom is not a crime." The atmosphere was electric, a mixture of hope and fear. Police trucks circled the area, but the chants grew louder. A young woman named Aisha, speaking through a megaphone, declared, "If they can stop Heche from attending a funeral, what else can they stop us from doing tomorrow?" Across the country, small protests began to appear in Arusha, Dodoma, Mwanza, and even in rural towns long isolated from political debate. Local riders, known as boda drivers, joined in solidarity, their motorcycle horns merging into a thunderous roar of resistance. For them, this was not just about politics, it was about dignity. In the capital, government spokespersons dismissed the unrest as youth confusion fueled by misinformation. State television aired messages praising stability and warning against foreign influence. But these words only fueled suspicion. Every time the government tried to silence the story, it grew louder online. Videos of police confronting unarmed demonstrators circulated with millions of views. Then came the border moment, the spark that transformed a domestic protest into a regional movement. At the Sarari-Isabia border, hundreds of young Kenyans arrived carrying flower signs and Kenyan flags. They came to honor Raila Odinga, but also to show solidarity with their Tanzanian peers. Across the fence, Tanzanian youths responded with raised fists and chants of Uhuru kwa wote, freedom for all. That scene, two groups of young Africans divided by a political line, yet united in spirit, became a symbol that spread across the internet. For the first time, East Africa's youth were not just witnessing oppression, they were standing against it together. As the hours passed, tension deepened. Security forces blocked journalists from filming. International lawyers who attempted to visit Heche's home were detained and deported. Still, the question refused to die. What kind of leader fears a man attending a funeral? By nightfall, the protests had evolved into something larger, not a movement for one man, but a movement for an entire generation that felt betrayed. In the words of a protester recorded live before being taken away by police, "We are not against Tanzania. We are saving it from silence." That night, as darkness fell over Dar es Salaam, it was clear Tanzania was no longer quiet. By the second week of unrest, Tanzania was no longer the same country. The morning calm that once defined its streets had given way to chance roadblocks and the smell of burning tires. What began as outrage over a travel ban had evolved into a national confrontation between the people and power itself. In Dar es Salaam, university campuses turned into gathering points. Students carried banners with messages like, "Democracy is not treason," and "We will not be silenced." Their marches were spontaneous, their energy contagious. For the first time, the fear of police batons and surveillance cameras was overpowered by collective anger. The government tried to disperse crowds with tear gas, but every crackdown only drew more people out. At the heart of this uprising was a single truth Tanzanians felt unheard. Months of rising costs, unemployment, and shrinking freedoms had left an entire generation feeling invisible. The arrest of Tundu Lissu and the silencing of John Heche became symbols of something deeper, the belief that ordinary citizens no longer had a voice in their own country. When videos of police beating unarmed students surfaced online, the outrage went viral. Tanzanians abroad in the UK, Canada, and South Africa began organizing solidarity vigils demanding accountability from President Samia Suluhu Hassan. Her administration responded with official statements labeling the movement as a coordinated foreign plot to destabilize Tanzania. Yet even state media's attempt to control the narrative failed to erase the haunting images circulating across the internet, young men and women running from tear gas, clutching their national flag, shouting, "This is our home too." The Sirari-Izabia border became the new front line of this story. Thousands gathered on both sides. Kenyan youth carried portraits of Raila Odinga and placards that read, "Justice has no borders." Tanzanian demonstrators replied with chants of, "We rise for truth." For a moment, the entire border seemed to vibrate with unity. Two nations divided by politics, but connected by pain. Security forces, nervous about the growing crowds, began sealing off the area. Witnesses reported armored vehicles and helicopters hovering above. The tension was palpable. Then came the sound, the sharp crack of gunfire in the distance. Panic spread instantly. Some claimed it was warning shots. Others insisted it was live ammunition. Dozens were injured in the stampede that followed. Videos of the chaos went viral within minutes, drawing condemnation from across East Africa. Meanwhile, inside the capital, the government's tone hardened. Officials declared that anyone participating in unauthorized assemblies would face prosecution under new anti-terror laws. The word terrorism was being used against students, activists, and journalists. This marked a turning point. The state was no longer just defending itself. It was attacking its own youth. And yet, amid fear and violence, acts of courage began to multiply. A group of lawyers in Arusha defied the government's ban and filed a petition demanding Heche's immediate release. Churches and mosques opened their doors to shelter protesters fleeing the police. Local musicians composed songs calling for unity and peace. Even some retired army officers began quietly voicing concern, warning that the suppression of dissent would only fuel instability. The government tried to show strength, but each arrest became another headline, each denial another reason for anger. The digital battlefield proved impossible to contain. TikTok and X were flooded with testimonies, drone footage, and live streams exposing police brutality in real time. A new generation of Tanzanians born into the digital era had found its weapon: truth shared online. Then came an image that defined the uprising. A young man standing alone in front of a police truck holding a torn Tanzanian flag. His face was bloodied, his voice trembling, but his words were clear. "You can beat us, but you can't erase us." That image spread across the world, appearing on news networks from Al Jazeera to CNN. For many, it was the moment Tanzania's silent youth finally found its voice. By the end of that week, the world was watching. The protests had reached their peak. The streets of Dar es Salaam were quiet again, but it was not peace. It was exhaustion. Beneath that fragile calm, a storm was still brewing. Tanzania stood on the edge between repression and rebirth, and no one knew which side it would fall on next. When the smoke finally cleared from the streets of Dar es Salaam, a heavy silence settled across Tanzania, the kind of silence that doesn't signal peace, but exhaustion. The protests had shaken the nation to its core. Thousands were arrested, dozens injured, and at least several unconfirmed deaths whispered through online networks before the posts were taken down. Yet what lingered most wasn't just fear, it was disillusionment. Across the country, people began to ask themselves a dangerous question. If speaking is a crime, what does freedom really mean? The first major impact was the collapse of public trust. Once viewed as a hopeful reformer, President Samia Suluhu Hassan now faced accusations of betrayal from the very youth who had celebrated her ascent. Her silence during the crisis only deepened suspicion. To many, she no longer represented inclusion or stability, but control. Local journalists who tried to ask critical questions were detained or stripped of their press credentials. Independent media outlets shut down or went underground using encrypted channels to continue reporting. In Dar es Salaam, university classes were suspended indefinitely. Professors sympathetic to the protesters were questioned by security agencies. The once bustling student cafeterias turned quiet. Many young Tanzanians fled to neighboring Kenya seeking temporary refuge. For the first time in a generation, Tanzania's youth, long seen as the pride of its peaceful democracy, began to feel like exiles in their own country. But the political consequences didn't stop there. Inside the ruling party, murmurs of division began to surface. Some senior officials feared the crackdown had gone too far, jeopardizing Tanzania's international image. Rumors circulated that several ambassadors had privately urged the president to open dialogue with civil society before foreign investment began to pull out. And indeed, the economic fallout came swiftly. Tourism bookings dropped sharply after global media aired footage of tear gas and chaos. The shilling weakened, and small businesses suffered as curfews and police patrols disrupted daily life. International investors, once confident in Tanzania's stable business environment, began to quietly pause new deals. Beyond the numbers, however, the emotional cost was immeasurable. In Arusha, a mother named Mariam told a local station, "My son was taken during the protests. I don't even know if he's alive. They say he was a threat. He was just a student." Her trembling voice became the haunting echo of a nation wounded by its own government. Meanwhile, civil society groups tried to fill the void left by political silence. Churches and mosques organized prayer gatherings. Human rights lawyers launched petitions to free detainees. A coalition of youth movements known as Generation Uwazi, the Swahili word for transparency, emerged online calling for truth commissions and constitutional reform. Their slogan spread like wildfire: "We don't need revenge, we need justice." The government responded by blocking several websites and tightening control over mobile networks, but censorship could no longer contain the story. Too many witnesses, too many recordings, too many lives changed forever. For many Tanzanians, the crisis had redefined what it meant to be a citizen. Fear turned to grief, and grief turned into resolve. As one activist wrote from exile, "They can control our streets, but not our memories." Tanzania will remember who silenced its youth. By mid-year, the nation had become a study in contrasts: outward, calm; inward, unrest. Schools reopened, but conversations remained hushed. Parliament resumed sessions, but opposition seats were empty. The flag still flew high, but its colors seemed dimmer than before. What began as a single act of political defiance had left behind a fracture that would take years to heal, a wound between government and people, trust and truth, power and promise. As images of chaos from Dar es Salaam and the Sirari border filled global news feeds, the world could no longer look away. Tanzania, once described by Western diplomats as a pillar of stability in East Africa, was now trending for all the wrong reasons. In Washington, the U.S. State Department issued a carefully worded statement calling for restraint on all sides and respect for fundamental freedoms. It was diplomatic language, cautious, deliberate, and calculated. But behind closed doors, analysts at think tanks like the Council on Foreign Relations and Brookings Institution debated whether President Samia's actions had crossed the line from authoritarian pragmatism into outright repression. One commentator on PBS remarked Tanzania is testing the limits of America's patience, but also its priorities. For decades, Tanzania had been one of Washington's quiet success stories, a reliable security partner, a key recipient of U.S. aid, and an anchor in a volatile region. But now, with young Tanzanians accusing their government of dictatorship and using social media to broadcast abuses, the image of partnership looked increasingly fragile. Human rights groups in New York and Brussels urged sanctions against senior officials. The United Nations Human Rights Council called for an independent inquiry. Yet the West's response remained restrained, unwilling to alienate an ally in the region while juggling crises in the Horn of Africa, Gaza, and Ukraine. Meanwhile, African voices began to rise in response. Kenya's opposition leaders condemned the violence and urged President Samia to release all political prisoners. South Africa's parliament debated whether the African Union should intervene, citing fears of a ripple effect across the continent's fragile democracies. Even Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, speaking during a youth conference in Ouagadougou, warned that a democracy that silences its people is no democracy at all. His words resonated far beyond West Africa, drawing comparisons between Tanzania's unrest and the wave of popular awakenings spreading across the continent. European media outlets framed the crisis differently. The BBC emphasized a woman president under immense pressure, while Le Monde in France questioned whether Western silence reflected double standards in Africa. Russian and Chinese state media, on the other hand, used the turmoil to criticize the West's narrative of African democracy, arguing that Tanzania's unrest proved that imported political models were doomed to fail. Across the African diaspora in London, Atlanta, Toronto, Tanzanian students and activists staged peaceful marches holding placards reading "Justice for Lissu, Freedom for Hech." They reminded the world that this was not a geopolitical chess game, but a human story, one of broken promises and unfulfilled dreams. By late 2025, global attention began to fade as newer crises took center stage. But the question remained, what will Tanzania become in the eyes of the world? To some, it was a nation struggling through the growing pains of democracy. To others, it was a warning proof that even the most stable African states can fall into repression if power goes unchecked. For Washington and its allies, Tanzania had become an uncomfortable mirror, a reminder that democracy left unattended can wither, not with a coup, but with silence. And for the rest of Africa, it had become a lesson that freedom cannot be imported or imposed. It must be defended again and again by those willing to speak, even when the world stops listening. Dawn returns to Dar es Salaam, but the air still feels heavy. Streets once filled with chants now lie quiet, littered with the ashes of burned posters and the echoes of unanswered questions. The government calls it restoration of order. The people call it the silence of fear. Tanzania stands at a crossroad. One path leads back to control, to the comfort of authority and the illusion of stability. The other points toward accountability, risk, and the painful rebirth of democracy. No law, no soldier, no tear gas can hide the fact that something in the national spirit has awakened. And once a people have tasted the courage to speak, it is impossible to make them forget the sound of their own voices. Beyond Tanzania's borders, the lesson is clear. Across Africa, from Nairobi to Niamey, from Ouagadougou to Addis Ababa, citizens are watching closely. They see that democracy is not a gift handed down by presidents or donors. It is a muscle that must be used or it weakens. Today's silence in Tanzania could easily become tomorrow's warning for the continent. When governments fear their youth, the future itself is in danger. For older generations abroad, for those in the United States who remember the civil rights marches of the 1960s, the images from East Africa feel hauntingly familiar. The raised fists, the police lines, the unarmed courage. History does not repeat, but it rhymes. And perhaps that rhythm heard again through African voices is what democracy needs to remember its heartbeat. In this moment, the question is not only for Tanzanians, will we choose silence or will we choose to listen? Because when a nation begins to silence its youngest citizens, it is not only losing dissent, it is losing direction. So let us speak of this, share this, and refuse to look away. The story of Tanzania is not over. It is being written right now by every voice brave enough to whisper the truth. If you believe that freedom in Africa must belong to its people, not to power, please share this story. If you believe that truth must travel further than fear, subscribe and stay with us, because the fight for honest leadership does not end here. For as long as voices rise, democracy still breathes.